Have reservation, can travel was a maxim for the wise last August bank holiday at King's Cross. For British Rail, a victim of their own success in stimulating passenger business, were trying out a novel experiment with the overcrowding which is so complained of. Reservations weren't compulsory, but if you hadn't booked your seat, you had to get one of the new boarding cards inspectors were issuing in the queues. A ticket on its own was no longer enough.
Unfortunately, there's no boarding cards left for this train, so you've got to queue 16:30, the next one you see.
This rationing of the numbers on trains puts BR in the awkward business of being cruel to its customers to be kind.
I presume this is my ticket to reserve my seat.
No, you've got to receive a reservation ticket. That's just to get on the train. It's not for a seat.
Well, how do they know that it's going to be fully booked? Why didn't they say?
Because,
you know, you're paying all this money.
There's so many seats booked. Right?
But I asked for
So
seats to be booked yesterday.
Then, when the seats is booked, they give so many of these boarding tickets. And when the boarding tickets is gone, that means it's full and standing.
The trains leave with satisfied customers seated and very few standing. But those left behind are furious. It's the passions our railway generates that make it so politically sensitive.
Stupid, absolutely stupid.
But did you know that you were supposed to have a boarding pass or a reservation?
There was nobody told anything about it. Nothing.
We've got return tickets.
We've got return tickets.
Nobody told us that we
anything.
needed a seat to go back, reserve a seat to go back. If we knew that when we bought them, we would have done.
No, I was told by the station staff here that in order to get a train for which I'd paid full standard fare, which is a considerable amount of money, more than the white service and blue service that you can get, that I wasn't able to get on the train because I hadn't made a reservation. You'll have to excuse me because I've got a boarding card for the Pullman service. Hopefully I might be able to get on it this time. Thank you very much indeed.
Customers would get a better deal, the government believes, with private trains. Although the next election will decide whether the Tories get the chance to privatise the railway, even today there are private trains running on British Rail. Lovingly restored by preservation societies, these pre-war relics are being leased by a private firm out for profit. On offer is a luxury tour around the Scottish Highlands. All that BR supply is the driver. Those who've reserved are mostly foreigners, paying £2,600 per person for the 6-day exclusive trip. Once railways are again open to private competition, this is the sort of venture at the budget as well as the luxury end of the market that the government would encourage. But since the government hasn't yet settled all the privatisation details, at last week's Tory conference, Cecil Parkinson chose to keep the plans his predecessor launched tentative.
As Paul Channon said last year, privatisation may be the best way forward. He set work in hand to find out whether and how best it could be done. And that work is making good progress. But those decisions are for the future.
What Cecil Parkinson kept back from last week's conference was that privatisation work is right on track. But because of the government's current difficulties, not least with water and electricity, rail has become the privatisation that, for the moment, dare not speak its name. Panorama tonight can disclose the radical approach ministers are taking towards rail privatisation, which, in the teeth of opposition from British rail management and unions, they're pressing ahead with.
I'm myself very, very convinced of the argument that the more essential the industry, the more essential it is that it doesn't stay in the public sector. I've never accepted this assertion that if it's an essential industry, it must stay in the public sector. I don't think public sector industries are, in the end, run for the benefit of the customer.
What we're seeing is an exercise in ideology. And I think the British public are becoming fed up with ideological exercises of that kind in relation to water, electricity, and now railway privatisation. And I think we'll give the thumbs down to it in 1991.
Anytime you choose kick off your shoes.
Whatever its future, BR with this ad quirkily seeks affection for current improvements. There are new trains, they are comfortable, but for many, it's still a mirage. A typical evening on the Intercity from Liverpool Street to Norwich. Typical also the new long-distance commuters, who are despairing because of sharp fare increases and chronically disrupted services. For them, Intercity is the British rail they love to hate.
The experience of travelling on this line is chronic. We're late every day. The buffet is filthy. You sit in the buffet and you feel as if you've been sitting on the pavement, you know, and you feel unclean. And I'm not satisfied.
This particular line is Intercity's Cinderella line. British Rail accept it. Even commuters elsewhere laugh at you when you say this is the line you travel on.
I would say it would be better if it were privatised. I believe if people like ourselves were running British Rail now, we'd all have been sacked, because we just wouldn't be able to provide the service that the customers expect.
Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I ask those of you...
Because its season ticket holders are so fed up, with delays exacerbated this summer by signalling failures, BR managers have arranged to answer complaints at a meeting in Ipswich. Considering it was a fine Friday evening, attendance was high, but so were tempers. Whatever one says about BR, one can't imagine many private companies daring to expose their managers to such an ordeal, especially before the cameras.
It's been a rough summer, isn't it? It really has been very, very bad. There is no reason why you should be patient with us.
At the moment, we've listened to two speakers who really haven't bothered to tell us the answers to any of the questions that have no doubt been raised. No. We don't know, for example, how much longer we are going to have to put up with a second-rate service for which we are having to pay an inordinate amount of money. We don't know, for example, whether or not management is ever held responsible for the incompetence that we have to put up with.
Hear, hear. This year's 21% rise in long-distance season fares has aroused intense anger, and the demand now is to know whether the same increase is in store for them next January.
This is where you're dead right, I'm going to duck out. You're dead right, I'm going to duck that one. And I'll duck it for two reasons. One is I don't know what the 1990 fares increase will be. And I will be totally honest with you. If I did know what the 1990s fares increase was going to be, I would not be in a position to tell you tonight anyway.
This kind of fencing, however well-intentioned, was like a red rag to some commuters who ended up venting their frustrations at each other as much as at British Rail operating diesels on newly electrified lines.
Now, it was nonsense to run diesels under the electrification from Colchester in 1952, and it's certainly nonsense to be running diesels under the electrification from Norwich after that investment, and it's even worse to be telling us that we should be paying for it. The electrification, I mean, because we're not even using it.
And have you, sir, also told that to your MP? Have you also made it clear? Yes. All right. You've interrupted other people. Now let me interrupt you for a change, then. We've had a lot from you already tonight, sir. Have you already told your MP that this government should be investing the same sort of money in its railways as most European countries do?
That's right, here.
With more heat than light, the meeting ended with few questions answered.
At that point, I'm going to close the public meeting by saying that I'm never going to chair one again. Thank you.
BR's managers, who'd already compensated customers with free journeys, claimed it had all been worthwhile.
The purpose of a meeting like this is it allows us to find out what the customers really think. It is valuable experience for us to find out what's really worrying them. They don't always come out with the things you expect them to come out with. So it's useful feedback for us. It allows us to demonstrate to them that we are actually thinking, caring management, that we're not actually faceless bureaucrats stuck in a building somewhere, and that's good for us.
Further up the East Coast, outside Durham, a more persuasive demonstration that BR are getting there is the electrification of the main line to Edinburgh. This massive £400 million investment would have been a credit to any private company. It's proceeding a year ahead of schedule, and it's an example of the financial turnaround British Rail's achieved these past 6 years. Investment's been doubled, while under pressure from government, the taxpayers' subsidy's been halved, and even a small operating surplus produced. It's the result of dividing up the BR monolith into smaller and more responsive management sectors, and it's the pride of the departing British Rail chairman.
I'm interested in managing the very best railway, both in this country and, so far as international opinion is concerned, the very best railway internationally. That's my objective, and I could see the way to do that was, in fact, to break out of the monolith, as you call it, and produce small units which will have an identified objective. They will be got bottom line responsibility, would have their own finances, their own authorities, and be held to account for it.
It may look like one British Rail, but Bob Reid restructured it into sectors, each separately managed. There's Intercity, with virtually all the profitable expresses. Network South East, which in addition to London, reaches from the Wash to Dorset and makes a loss. Provincial sector, with the Sprinter logo, covers all passenger services in the rest of the country and makes a big loss. And there's Rail Freight, which has been profitable for a decade. And finally, there's Parcels. Bob Reid welcomes privatisation, but only if his sectors are kept together as one unit. A rare sight on the railway, a Conservative cabinet minister seeing the train business for himself and authorising modern trains for London. Since Cecil Parkinson was reshuffled at the time of the rail strike, the new Transport Secretary has been looking at BR's current structure and sees in it a ready-made model for sell-off. As Energy Secretary, Mr. Parkinson broke up the monopoly of the electricity industry. Now, although no firm decision's been taken, he sees the advantages for competition in breaking up British Rail.
I suppose if you did break it up into separate companies, you'd get competition by emulation. You'd get smaller units, more accountable. For instance, Intercity has responded very well to becoming a separate business within British Rail. I think that you can, just from breaking down into smaller units, you can get great benefits.
Rather than leaving it, say, within one monolith, like BR PLC?
It's very difficult to get that same sort of identity of purpose in something quite so big, I would have thought.
Every time you say, let's break it up, let's privatise it, you have to be clear what the objective is. If the objective is, well, let's have fun and see what we can do, well, that's one objective. It wouldn't be mine. Mine would be, let's find a better way of looking after the customer and running a highly competitive railway.
The battle of the breakup of British Rail has been largely fought here at the Department of Transport, behind closed doors. Teams of government consultants have been wrangling over the options. There's been intense lobbying from Tory think tanks. There's been sharp input, too, from the Prime Minister's policy unit. Panorama's learned that the leading radical option now in ministers' minds is to break up BR into its separate sector businesses. Starting, say, with Intercity PLC or Rail Freight, each private company would be floated off, owning its track, its trains, and most important of all, its property assets in land and stations. It's known as the sector sell-off.
I think that is the way it is going to go. I think we're going to see a sector basis to the privatisation programme.
With each sector company owning its own track and its own everything, it's a whole company.
I think it will probably be a vertically integrated industry. That is to say, the companies running the trains will also be owning the tracks. But there should be a very important proviso here, and that is that other companies should have the right of access, should have running rights over the track of another company.
But it was this that swayed the government in favour of break-up. From the Prime Minister down, Tories were incensed, both by the nationwide impact of last summer's strike and the public sympathy for the underpaid railwomen. To see a union leader claiming victory after all the Tory legislation was the last straw.
And we're going to win this one, lads, because it's too important.
Future chairmen of separate private railways, ministers reckoned, could use the law against secondary action to prevent a national strike. Would, though, breaking it up into private companies prevent you striking in every company?
Well, there's an answer to that as well. I mean, you could ballot all the companies at the same time and pull them all out at the same time. So the whole thing's a nonsense. And if that's the only yardstick they're going to use to determine the standard of service that the British public deserve, then I think they'll get the thumbs down for that as well.
But industrial relations isn't the main problem with breaking up British Rail, it's the fiendish complexities of keeping the network connected. How well it'll work in future can be judged from the way it works now. An express from Portsmouth Harbour crossing all three British Rail passenger sectors en route to Cardiff illustrates how complicated it might become to serve all these stations if all the costs and ticket income had to be sorted out in future between rival private companies. It's complicated enough under British Rail.
Although this train is run by British Rail's provincial sector, its journey today will take it across track owned by all three of British Rail's passenger businesses. Here in Portsmouth, it starts out on lines run by Network South East. In the middle bit, it switches to track run by its own provincial sector. And then it'll end up on lines run by Intercity. This sector-by-sector progress fundamentally affects how its costs are split up between British Rail's separate business sectors.
Cross-boundary journeys like this now account for as much as 20% of passenger revenue. At the moment, all the divvying up the line costs and the ticket revenue is done more or less amicably inside British Rail. But if it were different privatised companies, this train would have to be paying Network South East plc a commercial rate for the use of its lines.
At this next junction, our train switches from Network South East to provincial track, and its cost allocations change dramatically.
Now our train's running on track belonging to its own sector. After privatisation, this would be the only part of the journey when it wouldn't have to pay another company for use of the track. But it's all change again at the next junction. Outside Bath, our train waits while Intercity takes priority on Intercity track. In future, as our train moved ahead towards South Wales, it would pay a private Intercity for its use of the lines. Obviously, such companies could negotiate a commercial rate, but the complications are one reason why Bob Reid is still battling against breakup.
I see a broken-up railway into lots of little companies which are not properly coordinated, a great disadvantage for my customers, because there will be constant friction between those companies trying to make more profit at the expense of giving good customer spread of services and that sort of thing. There will be arguments about the use of railway track that they all use. There will be arguments about terminals and staffing, that sort of thing.
Well, that's even worried Bob Reid, hasn't he, who's gone around actually calling for the privatisation and agreeing with the government. Now he's worried because you're going to break it into small sections. And if they go to privatisation of it, how do you deal with the track problems? How do you actually properly put the costings to it? How do trains run in competition along the same piece of line? It's a nonsense, an absurdity, more to do with its ideological requirements than meeting the public need.
I don't think anybody is proposing that we go back to hundreds of little regional railway companies. What we're seeking to do this time is to take advantage of new railway technology and introduce the private sector into the railways to seek innovation and efficiency. At the moment, the sectors are running themselves as separate businesses to a very large extent, but they're still answerable to the central board. If you like, you have this bureaucracy looking over the whole of the sector business. And I think the advantages of privatisation will be to simplify the bureaucracy and allow the sector managers and the sector directors to make their own decisions.
And there's not much doubt which will be the first stop. image of catering principally to the profitable business executive market. But in fact, their typical customers, as passengers are now officially called, are people travelling to visit friends, people you'd rarely see in the dining car. People who rarely leave the considerable comfort of standard class unless it's to use the train's up-to-date facilities.
Clear. We're hurtling through Cambridgeshire at the moment. We're doing, I think it's around 100 miles an hour.
We have turned Intercity around. We've had one of the fastest industrial turnarounds in British history. We are running to profit, which is the only railway, similar railway in the world to run to profit.
And it is therefore with the greatest pleasure I name locomotive...
As Bob Reed names the 225's new loco, you don't see the words BR much round Intercity. It's the swallow logo their managers boast of as their brand image, not the double arrows. This new loco is probably the first in British history to be named after a logo. Bob Reed is proud of Intercity's success, but he worries about disaggregating or breaking up the network when ministers say Intercity could be floated off as a PLC tomorrow.
I think Intercity is a very good business, but I think it would be even better if the people who were in it had a share in it, owned part of the business they were working in, where we had worker shareholders. You know, I just think people could be even more motivated than they are now. But Intercity is a good example of what can be done, I agree.
I don't in fact believe that Intercity is in a fit state to be floated off tomorrow, because it hasn't got a balance sheet, it's got no track record, it's not getting a proper return on its assets. That comes later. But I still think that there is a major problem in disaggregating the network. Intercity goes throughout. It's very dependent on being fed by good connections from the other sectors. If that's not held together, then each sector gets into difficulty.
Network South East, covering London's commuters and beyond, would likely be the next passenger sector to be privatised. But would private companies be able to make any money? And what would happen to services for the long-suffering customers? On a typical morning on the North Kent line, recognised by BR to be one of its Cinderella commuter services, it's business as usual.
Morning. Are we still running 20 minutes late? Yeah, at the moment. Yeah. Okay, cheers.
We apologise. Line services this morning.
While the South East's boom lasts, it's boosted passenger growth. But with staff shortages and shortage of trains, the service is a daily ordeal.
I think we're finding more and more that the trains are getting more and more crowded. That's one problem we've got. Also, the trains on these lines tend to be the oldest and dirtiest, scruffiest trains. I think they must run on the whole network.
I have a suit on, as you can see, and my cleaning bill is tremendous, really. The stench of the seats is unbearable after a while. I've just been on holiday for a week. This is my first week back, and my trousers are starting to smell already from the seats.
Network South East derives a huge £900 million turnover from its passenger hauls. It's a bigger business than Intercity's and puts it almost in the top 100 British companies. Yet, like most capital cities, the Network South East peak passengers still need government subsidy if fares aren't to go through the roof. Commuters, particularly south of the Thames, have no real alternative to their trains. They're literally a captive market, which, after privatisation, would need protection.
We've got an underground out this way, so trains are the only way we've got getting into work. So we're all totally dependent on the railway. You know, other Essex and they've got undergrounds. We've got no other way. Sometimes you get to work quite exhausted before you start.
We need either better planned carriages, cleaner carriages, and if we have to stand, more room for standing, you know, instead of being wedged between people's legs all the time.
Do you think it might be any better if the railway were privatised?
I think so. I think it can only improve it.
London's fare-paying millions are supposed to ease Network South East into breaking even in 3 years' time and so require no more government subsidy. But would that be enough to persuade the city that the capital's passengers could then generate a profit?
What we're actually saying is we've reached the neutral position where we can just about live without the subsidy. We're within 8% of living without the subsidy. That doesn't mean that we can automatically give a huge return on the investment of the scale that the private owner would want.
Network South East has mighty plans for the 90s, both new trains and new lines across London. Its director warns that giving it all on a plate to the private sector might invite exploitation.
I think there would be a temptation to exploit the system. There's no doubt that commuters are captive in London for 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the evening. 80% of commuting into London is by rail, be it the Underground or be it Network South East. Someone could choose to run far less trains and cram people into the fewer trains. You'd certainly make more money by doing that because you'd reduce your asset base. Or you could choose to price up almost to the limits of what people would have to pay to come into London.
Chris Green, the current director of it, suggests that if it fell into private hands, the temptation would be to exploit.
But that's where the regulator is so important in all these privatizations. I mean, I'm sure that every single one, BT, wherever you look, where we've privatized a monopoly, people have said, oh, the customers are going to get clobbered. In fact, the regulator steps in and he enforces a regime that makes sure that whatever the ambitions of the monopolist, the rights of the customer are protected.
In contrast to big city commuting, this is the social railway. It's rush hour at Gainsborough, a sizable town in Lincolnshire. British Rail asserted earlier this year that nobody used the trains to get to work. But Panorama found one, a young man on his way to a training course at Curtin Lindsey. This line is currently the only one in Britain under formal closure notice. British Rail claims it's so little used, it would be more economic to substitute a bus service for the weekday-only service of 3 trains. Ministers admit that privatising lines like this all over the country could be a financial headache. Most are also in the Tory shires. Here in Lincolnshire, there's been protest, and a formal public inquiry is planned later this autumn, but can only hear cases of personal hardship, complaining that the trains are timetabled absurdly, or that they're needed for social uses carries no weight under the law. On the day we filmed, there were only 4 fare-paying passengers, a bit below the usual average.
If they close this line down, how would you get to work?
Simple as that. I would not be able to get to work. Don't know about bringing the bus, same sort of time in the morning, but an hour later, instead of 9 o'clock, it'd be 10 o'clock, and that would be no good for me.
Gradually, these small towns will get isolated, and there'll be just no transport for the public at all, unless you're lucky enough to own your own cars.
What do you think? What do you think the government should do about it?
Well, I think there should be a certain amount of subsidy for them, and encouragement to get folk to use the trains in the public transport, because there's still a lot of folk who haven't got their own cars.
In Brigg, a small Humberside town that will be wiped off the railway map, protest campaigners are out collecting signatures.
Do this side, we'll do
that side.
Across the road.
Yeah, we've got an hour to wait for the train, so we should be able to get plenty of signatures, I would have thought.
Righto, so you do then, we'll cross over. Okay.
And all we're really asking is no commitment to yourself if you just give us your signature to sort of support our case.
Yeah, possible, yeah.
Thank you very much indeed.
Because if the railway goes, the Brig goes,
That's
sort
right.
of, because people in force...
Closure of lines is the last thing ministers want associated with privatisation. So although they haven't yet decided how to involve the private sector with lines like these, they're toying again with moving the present national subsidy given to BR down to the local level. Is not an inevitable consequence of privatisation there that lots of those lines would have to close down because private operators couldn't possibly make a profit out of it?
No, not necessarily. And we have established the principle already in the case of buses, that it is preferable, we believe, to identify the size of the subsidy you're prepared to pay. And in the case of buses, say, here is the subsidy that is available, now put in your price for running the service. So we've got a precedent established of subsidized private sector activities, and I think would be absolutely essential were British Rail to be privatised, that the rights of the rural customers be protected in that way.
Lincolnshire is one of a number of county councils that's put money into the railway. They've even helped revive services British Rail had written off. Yet while no one would refuse a subsidy, local opinion is divided over putting public train services out to private tender.
We would be limited to the one company, the rail company, but I'm sure we could talk, and I see great benefits of getting that subsidy down to a local level, and we can put it then where it's required.
Pipe dream. Don't think it could ever happen. If you put this particular rail system out to privatisation, I don't think anyone would touch it with a barge pole, to be quite honest. There's not enough money to be made in it.
But you believe that the line should continue to be subsidised?
Oh, yes.
Forever?
We're already subsidising transport. Every time a lorry goes on the road, or a bus goes on the road, or a car goes on the road, with the amount of money that has to be spent on road maintenance these days, we're already subsidising.
With all the problems of profitability British rail sectors have around the country, the wonder is why any investors would be interested in them. The answer is that you don't just buy trains and lines, you get something else. The railway's most glittering prize is not its trains, but its huge property assets. This is part of London's Victoria Station, the valuable space above the railway lines developed into a shopping centre. It's happening in stations all over the country. British Rail's own property board is currently bringing in yearly profits of £300 million to underpin train operations. They've already sold off assets worth nearly £1 billion, with more than that to come. Developers haven't been slow to sense a property bonanza in the making.
What is it that would attract city investors, actually, to invest in private railways?
Well, I'm sure that the property aspect must play a large part. It is tangible, can be valued, and forms the asset base of so many companies. It's quite normal. So I'd see property playing its part in the underlying attitude of the city towards whatever may occur.
BR's freight sector was early on identified by Tory privatisers as a new opportunity for railway profit, particularly with Channel Tunnel through trains to the continent. But it's the freight business's enormous property portfolio that's the irresistible attraction. Because of the change to moving goods by whole trainloads, marshalling yards all over the country are now no longer needed. Already here at Stratford in East London, in preparation for a new freight terminal for Channel Tunnel trains, British Rail's own surveyors are rationalising their property plans.
Immediately behind the traction maintenance depot is the Freightliner terminal.
Hundreds of surplus acres here are planned to be sold off for housing and superstores. Privatisation will need to ensure that land speculators aren't permitted to neglect their train services.
Private investors will be very attracted to making a lot of money. That means asset strippers will be in, not people talking about meeting the transport needs of a country. We've had 10 years of that, and I don't think it's been to our advantage.
But Channel Tunnel development, which was the jewel in the government's private sector crown, has suddenly jolted the promise the Tories saw in rail privatisation. It was at government insistence that the high-speed line linking the terminal here outside Folkestone to London was to be built by the private sector in a joint venture with British Rail. But burying the line in tunnels has doubled the cost. Test boring for samples last week was entering unknown and difficult terrain, revealing perhaps one of the major reasons deep tunnels have never been bored under South London before, and one of the reasons the private consortia's involvement is now seriously in question.
We've got a bunch of what I see is ham-fisted amateurs squabbling over who should provide the money. That's selling Britain short. We need that type of infrastructure, and we ought to get on with providing it and not getting involved in the sort of indecent squabbling that we're seeing now.
Faced with a crisis over the high-speed link, Cecil Parkinson chose to fly over the route through Kent to see for himself. The government's response to environmental protest has been to force the consortium, at great expense, to divert the line away from choice housing areas, all of them in Tory constituencies. Awaiting the minister, are local Tory MPs and representatives of protest groups still seeking changes to the route.
I said I'd like to come and see the line of route. And it is useful, I mean, quite honestly.
And the embarrassing question for a privatiser, will the government come to the aid of the private sector?
This is a private sector project. It's going to be very, very successful when it's built. All the studies show that there is a very big demand. It will produce a very big flow of income over a very long period. And the private sector consortium have just got to find ways of bridging the gap.
The private consortia have told BR, as Mr. Parkinson knows, that they'll be unable to build the line unless the government puts in public funds.
Well, they're certainly saying that. But whether that's a negotiating stance to force government into producing money, I wouldn't know. But government has got a great problem in that it has consistently said, and as the Channel Tunnel Bill said, that any railway system that is associated with it, any capital, has to be on a commercial basis.
If it came to the point it was no high-speed link at all, and just the existing one, or the government would have to help, what would you do? Would you go then to their colleagues?
The moment I answer your question, the negotiations between the two parties stop, and they then start focusing on how the government can be involved. And at the moment, the negotiations are at a very delicate stage, and I want them to focus on how they can cope with what is essentially their problem.
However much the Channel link has upset the privatisation promise, there are evidently parts of British Rail where pickings are to be had by the private sector. But the everyday railway is in fact the most routine of businesses, and it's here where the success of privatisation would be tested. Some customers are there to be wooed.
If privatisation brings in more capital for British Rail and the actual service improves, then I'd go along with it.
I think it would be scandalous to sell it all off to private investors. I think the problem with privatisation on British Rail in the past is that often the juicy bits of British Rail are sold off, the hotels, the ferries, the bits that make money, and I think this next phase of privatisation could well mean the same thing.
As the debate unfolds, the public will want assurance that a vital nationwide service isn't being fragmented for political reasons, unless the government in its current difficulties has decided to think again.
What it is a study that's going on, progress is being made, and we will, in due course, come to this subject, and I will go to Cabinet colleagues and we'll take a decision.
But Cecil Parkinson, the privatiser, still wants, favours privatising British Rail if it can be done.
My own personal belief is that the public is better served by private sector companies.
But if it's broken up, though, won't you feel sad?
Yes, I'll be sad because I don't think it will give the answer that all the customers are looking for, which is a higher quality, more satisfying, excellently run railway that they begin to like and respect.
To achieve such transformation from the British Rail we love to hate, the privatisers would have to do even better and give this basic pledge that your train would always be there if you want it at a fare you can afford. Anything less risks making rail a privatisation too far.